Welcome to Ippodhu. We are in the business of speaking truth to power. But what constitutes power is still being debated in newsrooms. As a digital media outlet, we want the government to be accountable, we want the businesses to be accountable, we want the institutions to be accountable. Couple of fortnights ago, when Raya Sarkar, a law student from Davis, California, released a list of perpetrators of sexual harassment in Indian academia, it created a lot of conversations. Ippodhu was one of the outlets to join the conversation and in fact openly support that conversation. And we have with us today Manasi Karthik, a student of SOAS University of London, who openly supported Raya Sarkar's list, that is the naming and shaming of the perpetrators of sexual harassment. And we will have a conversation today about this, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And after the list was published, there were a set of feminists, and in fact I called them self-styled feminists in my interview with Raya Sarkar, but a lot of people who are feminists in Tamil Nadu took exception to my statement, saying that how can you call Kavita Krishnan a self-styled feminist? Because she has been part of a long struggle, feminist struggle, and she has been talking sense. And how can you say that? I said, as a man, I apologize because because maybe I was seeing it from the perspective of underdogs and thought, what Raya Sarkar is doing is something very great. And how do you react to that statement on Kafila by well-established feminists who said that how can you do this without even verifying? It is not authentic, it is not credible. And how do you react to that statement by the feminists?
I mean, like you said, I don't think that we necessarily want to be saying that women like Kavita Krishnan, Niveta Menon, Brinda Grover, and the other women who were signatories on that statement were self-styled feminists. They've all done a lot of extremely good work, and I personally have a lot of respect for them and have learned a lot from them for the many different issues that they've stood up for over the years and the very difficult battles that they've fought. And definitely, like young women like me, stand on their shoulders, and I've learned so much from them over the years. But especially because they're such well-established feminists, because they have crusaded against such difficult issues, especially because we look up to them so much. It was a huge letdown for myself and other women of my age, especially young women in academia, early career researchers, to see these women whom we looked up to, whom we thought were there to protect us, whom we thought were there to support us in the feminist struggle, come out and make the kinds of statements they made. And the nature of statements that they make was not simply saying that there's no credibility, but to go to the extent of equating this to vigilantism, equating this to a kangaroo court, to a cup panchayat. I think those are very dangerous and misleading equivalences that have been made by women whom we looked up to, and they're extremely dangerous, especially because so Kavita Krishnan, for example, said that this could be a way to target minorities, it could be a way to target Dalit men. But the issue here is that the men on the list were not Dalit men. The men on the list were upper caste men in positions of power. And they know as well as anybody else how difficult it is to follow whatever is quote-unquote due process. As we speak right now, JNU does not have the independent GS cash that these women themselves work to instate. So how do they expect us to take recourse to due process? And why do they feel that creating an outlet for women to sort of express these issues while protecting their anonymity amounts to a kangaroo court? A Facebook post does not amount to a court of any kind. And we've also seen that since the list, there's been no consequences whatsoever for the men who've been named on the list. Whereas on the other hand, women who shared the list have been attacked, they've been vilified. Raya Sarkar was blocked from Facebook. So these are the sorts of issues that we're dealing with at this moment.
Yeah, can you differentiate between the internal complaints committee that is involved and GS Catch, which is just, as you pointed out, just disbanded, that is Gender Sensitization Committee Against Sexual Harassment. Can you differentiate? Because many people still think that, ICC is the best form of due process. Many people, though there are a section of people who are talking about reforming ICC, can you differentiate how these two things are different?
Yeah. So just to put it very simply, an ICC is an internal committee to the institution, which means that there is no autonomy and there's no sort of impartial way of assessing the claims, whereas institutions like JNU, for example, created an autonomous body to deal with these complaints. So just to give listeners a sense of what a woman might go through when trying to make a formal allegation, which is what these feminists have called for. Oftentimes, as is the case with one of the men who was named on the list, it's been publicly written about on articles on the internet that women tried to make a complaint against this professor on the list, and before they were allowed to make a formal allegation, the woman is expected to go to her professor and express to him on no uncertain terms that his comment has been inappropriate. And only if the behavior continues following that sort of explicit withdrawal of consent can the woman then go ahead with a formal allegation. So these are the ways in which women are sort of thwarted from pursuing formal allegations, and especially the reason why something like an ICC makes the whole process makes the victim sort of re-victimized, places the entire responsibility on the victim and places the victim at risk. So of course a woman who's already vulnerable, who's sort of in her early career and depends on her supervisor, whether it's for letters of recommendation or for supervision or for like the successful completion of her PhD itself, is not going to choose to go to an ICC.
Okay, because you talked about the PhD scholar going through this, we had a case in the University of Madras here, right here. A woman student came out complaining to the Commissioner of Police in the city, saying that she has been sexually harassed. That made headlines, but it was buried under the carpet later. There was no follow-up. Because as you said, do you think there should be a rethink on how PhD is done? Because there are very few experts in the chosen area. If you have to do some PhD on telecom, there might be only one guide available in a particular university. How do they go about this rethink of the PhD system itself? Should they be allowed to move to other universities? Should there be an inter-university kind of arrangement for that?
Yeah, like you've identified, I think it's the reason that a list like this has come out in institutions and professions like media, like academics, is because these institutions are themselves sort of weighted against the women. So the issue again that the feminists who release a statement are missing is that there's an institutional hierarchy and an institutionalized power that's at play here. And when in addition to that gendered issue, there is also the institutionalized issue, women are additionally going to be prevented from sort of making a complaint. So just to explain how it works in academics, for example, like you said, there might just be one supervisor who is in your field. And very often, because this person is in a position of power, it's very different from being able to quit a job. The consequences, if you quit your job, are very different from the consequences to your career of quitting a PhD. There's also the additional issue of the social networks in these kinds of institutions being so small, and like social capital being so important in terms of journals which you publish in, the peer review process, and so on. And academia also has a very well-known star system that many people have critiqued. And so I think academics definitely needs fundamentally a way for women to make these complaints and for the complaint to, at the first instance, be anonymous and be taken seriously, for this institution to protect the woman. So, for example, you don't want to make a complaint only after you've confronted your professor in person or confronted the harasser in person, and then having to encounter this person. So, for example, in Berkeley, there were many very, very high-profile cases. But even after media attention and even after a committee found the professor in question at fault for the crimes that he was accused of, he continued to teach in the institution for 2 years. So for 2 years, victims had to sort of study under this professor and work under this professor, while the professor faced no consequences. The dean of Berkeley, similarly faced no consequences except for being able to take leave on a small pay cut. So clearly the issue is anonymity and sort of acting to protect the victim, to ensure that the victim does not have to continue depending professionally or personally in any capacity on the harasser in question.
Yeah, you are within the academia. You have chosen to speak in support of Raya Sarkar from day one, which was like very few women within academia have come out and openly supported Raya Sarkar. You were long post supporting Raya Sarkar. Even we carried it under the interview of Raya Sarkar because it was self-explanatory. It was saying that this is probably the only way that we can feel safe. And how was the reaction from within academia and from outside? Maybe your friends, family, how did they react to your stance?
First of all, thank you so much for carrying the Facebook post that I published right after the list was shared. And in terms of what you've said about very few women coming out in support of the list or coming out to share the list, one thing that I want to note is that repeatedly what we saw after the list was published is that you had young women or young students or early career researchers who just finished their PhDs, and these were the people who were sharing the list. In some cases, thankfully, it was also young men and early career men in academia who were sharing the list. So clearly the issue here is that this is a concern that people earlier on in their careers in these institutions like academia are facing. Whereas if you look again and again at the people who came out against the list, sort of protecting their colleagues, Nivedita Menon asks, how is it that she's powerful, she's fought these battles too? But the issue is that these women who came out against the list don't have to fight these battles anymore. They are well established, they're much further on in their careers, they don't have to contend with PhD supervisors, they're very well published, and they don't have to contend with establishing those networks that are what really get you through in academia. And what are sort of a make or break in your career. So if it comes out that you're an early career researcher who's shared this list, it could very well happen that people sort of start gossiping about you, that you're called, a loudmouth, or all of these things, that the many different ways that young women are vilified for speaking out against themselves. And it goes around that you're a troublemaker, and people stop wanting to work with you. And this is the sort of risk that young people are constantly having to put themselves at in order to make themselves heard. So ideally what we'd want is people in positions of power, people who already have the privilege, who don't have to take these risks to stand out and make safer spaces. But we're seeing that again and again what's happening is that those people who already have power want to protect those who are in power, as has happened with this list.
Do you think creating empowering conditions in academia, like if you take India, the higher education enrollment or the diversity in higher education itself is a major issue.
Yes.
In terms of gender, in terms of caste. There is no social justice in terms of enrollment to higher education. Do you think in the long run it will be sorted out if you have better higher education enrollment in India? There is more diversity and there will be more voices about such oppressions or concealment of sexual harassment, whatever. But at the same time, we have this question coming from societies like the United States and UK also, that where somebody like Christine Fair, who is with the Georgetown University, is also talking about you should have the attitude, to if I don't have a PhD in this particular chosen area, I can have PhD in some other subject. That is, in her case, there is she moved on from a particular subject to a different subject. Do you think that kind of mobility is possible in a society like India?
So I just want to highlight two statistics that have come out in the light of this whole thing in terms of diversity in academics in India. So researchers have found that only 3% of vice chancellors in universities in India are women, and in terms of established professor positions, you have only 1.5% that are occupied by women. So there's an extremely skewed statistic that we're working with here. Also, in terms of the internal complaints committee that we were talking about earlier, looking into the UGC for statistics as to which universities are Vishaka compliant reveals no results. So as a student or as an associate professor going into a new job, you have no idea as to whether the university that you're going into is Vishaka compliant, the Vishaka
guidelines.
The Vishaka guidelines. So you're sort of made unaware as to what you're getting into in terms of how your rights and liberties will be protected. So at the very least, sort of perhaps bringing that 3% and that appalling 1.5% up and simply making this data available as to which universities are Vishaka compliant, whether the ICC operates, whether there's a GS cash. These are immediate, definite, actionable steps that can be taken towards making higher education in India more diverse and more accessible and more safe. Right?
Okay. Coming to talk about Nivedita Menon's a couple of arguments that the list is detrimental to women themselves because they damage their credibility, and also that the list targets left-leaning intellectuals. That is her argument. And how do you react to that?
In terms of the first issue, again, I think this comes back to sort of equating a list like this to a kangaroo court or a cup panchayat. I think the issue really is here that there is no legal consequence that the list called for, and in fact, it was more of an effort for women to say, look, at least if there's nothing that I can do, if filing a formal allegation is going to be such an arduous process that puts the burden on me as a victim, at the very least, maybe I can make it more safe for other women. Maybe I can warn other women. So there's an extremely dangerous equivalence being made here. And in terms of the fundamental issue that we're dealing with here is that in the case of Harvey Weinstein and in the case of so many other abusers who've not been named right now, it's taken multiple women to come out and to make statements before they're taken seriously. Women are constantly vilified and never really listened to when they make a complaint. And I think this is sort of what Nivedita Menon is talking about when she says that this movement, I'm against this not just because I'm trying to protect men, but because this is an issue for women to think about as well, in terms of it damaging the credibility. But I think the issue really here is that Nivedita Menon's statement damages the credibility. It's not us that are damaging our credibility by sort of using whatever means we do have at our disposal in an institution that's systematically weighed against us. We are not damaging our own credibility. We are doing whatever we can with the very limited means we have to simply keep ourselves safe. Whereas women like Nivedita Menon and others who signed that statement actually calling for the list to be withdrawn in addition to sort of calling it names, are the ones who are damaging our credibility instead of sort of taking women seriously. And that's what creates this culture of shame and this culture of silence, which is really what needs to be addressed here.
And coming to the left-leaning intellectuals being targeted.
I think the point really is, for example, Ramchandra Guha has actually said that there are very few right-wing intellectuals in the South Asian scene. So if there's going to be a list of men in South Asian academics, it's going to be a list of left-leaning men automatically. But that aside, I think that it's extremely dangerous to sort of use one's politics as a pretext to sort of protect men against this. The issue repeatedly has been left-leaning or right-wing politics does not equate to practice. A woman's experience of harassment shouldn't be questioned simply by the tokenism of left-leaning or right-leaning. I think myself, Raya, and many other women who shared the list, many other men who shared the list, were as far left as it can get. But we don't think that this leftism should stand in the way of us sort of calling out abusers, and we don't think that our leftism should make it such that we can't speak about our own experience and our own systematic vulnerabilities in this issue.
Yeah, in fact, there were 3 men in Chennai who were named, but I'm not going to take their names. In fact, I spoke to one of them, and he was telling me that, this is a very random list, and maybe tomorrow your name will be on the list, Bill. So, are you going to write about it? I said, I'm just working on a story. I may be writing about it. Do you think, in this context, do you think innocent men could be named? And if so, that is one of the basis on which they wanted the withdrawal of the list. In fact, the list was also withdrawn for several other reasons which Raya had explained. Do you think the danger of innocent people being named, like they even quoted Mahatma Gandhi, you cannot punish an innocent person. Somebody was quoting that also. So yeah, how do you react to that?
I mean, if there's anybody who should be on that list posthumously, it's Mahatma Gandhi, because he himself has admitted to sleeping with his niece. But to go back to the question at hand here is whether innocent men can be on the list. Yes, of course, innocent men their names could be on the list, and this is also something that I acknowledged in the Facebook post that I wrote and that you subsequently shared. I think the issue here is that the men on the list, this list, not any list, this particular list, were upper caste men who occupy positions of privilege. So what I said was that these are men who've written very eloquently about much more complex issues like colonialism and capitalism and all of the other injustices that the world has faced. So can't these men simply, like social media is a platform for the exchange of views. That is the purpose of such a list, for these men to then come out and engage in that conversation, for them to be held accountable. And subsequently they have. Many of these men have come out and questioned why their names are on the list and denied any allegations. And in 3 cases, after the men have come out and publicly denied any wrongdoing, the victims who've been facing harassment from them have named themselves, have put themselves at risk, and gone into detailed complaints and detailed explanations as to what happened, why they could not make complaints at the time, and so on. And all of this is available publicly. But what I also want to highlight here is that in addition to the fact that men are equally powerful, men can speak for themselves as they have been so long, is that if there is a danger that innocent men can be on the list, there is an equally real, if not more real danger, that women have been living with the fear of sexual violence, have been living with harassment and being unable to do anything about it, being asked for ridiculous claims like having to go talk to your own abuser for years, and women are fed up. So why is it okay for women to have to live with sexual harassment? While it's not okay for men to live with the possibility that their name could maybe someday end up on a list? Why is it that we have a system that protects men and is concerned about men to this extent that when there is the vaguest insinuation made against them, women are attacked, whereas when women have to face sexual harassment on an everyday basis and institutional vulnerability all the time, the system is not willing to stand up for them and is instead willing to go so far as to vilify them, to call them panchayats, to insist that they withdraw allegations. Really, like whose needs are being, prioritized here?
Yeah. And coming to the last question of the interview, this even from the rights perspective, you should be documenting it, right? Any rights violation or rights abused, you should be documenting it. As a human rights journalist also, I think that you should start with documenting what is happening. So the confidentiality in the ICC is also adding to the continuance of this sexual harassment on campuses. Do you think so? Also, the list is also coming from the rights perspective. I think the documentation is very important so that men behave on campuses, particularly men in positions of power can behave on campuses. Do you think so, from the rights perspective?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think both these issues of anonymity as well as sort of documenting the extent of these cases and the extent of harassment is extremely important. Whereas in a lot of situations, even if there is a committee in your institution that promises to protect your anonymity, really it comes down to trust. As a woman, do I trust that the committee that I'm going to complain to will follow through on protecting my anonymity? If the person against whom I'm making the complaint is powerful enough and has enough connections, then will my anonymity be protected? And I think bringing out documentation about the sheer extent which people seem to constantly be surprised by. I don't know why people, every time a new issue comes out, people say, "Oh, was it him too? Is it so prevalent? I'm so surprised as to how it's so prevalent." Let's stop being surprised as to how this is so prevalent. I think enough women have come out and said "Me too," but I think it's time for others to come out and establish the fact that this is extremely prevalent, that this has been documented, and there are serious issues at stake.
Yeah, as you said, I also feel that documenting, having a conversation, and then changing the system or shaking up the system, probably that is the way to go. Thank you so very much for coming and having a conversation on the list, because you are one of the very few people who have come out openly and talked about it and talked in support of the list, and that requires a lot of courage and a lot of conviction. Thank you so very much for coming to Ippodhu and sharing your thoughts.
Thanks so much for having me.